Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks for being here on today's special about inflation. Just imagine you've been working hard your entire life. You've been doing everything the right way. You've been saving your money, being a good steward of your money, investing your money properly, and then it's not worth anything anymore. Your 401k is worth half of what it was the day before. It's potentially what's coming. So what is inflation? Why is it coming? And what do we do about it? What do we do about it as a country? And then, like, that ship has sailed. Like it's coming. So we need to do things as a country, sure. But I think more importantly right now is what do you do personally, just financially, for your family, right? You, what do you do? How do you best protect yourself to weather this storm? And that's what we're going to explore today, and I'm really glad you're here. I view it as a tidal wave. I don't know, maybe that's a trite visual or metaphor, but it's a tidal wave that's coming, inflation, and it just seems like no one cares. Like, I don't know, like no one sees it coming, or they just don't care, or what, but it is going to absolutely pound this country, and it's going to affect everyone. And you can kind of already see it now with food prices. I see it at restaurants. We've gone to a couple restaurants lately. Prices are through the roof, and portions have gone significantly down. I went to a hamburger place the other day, and the hamburger was like this big because they can't charge $30 for a hamburger, right? So we're already starting to see it with food, and we're going to start seeing it in even more places as well. Why? We've never spent this much money as a country, federal government. We've not ever in the history of mankind has anyone ever spent this much money. Biden's budget is $6 trillion, and that's on top of stimulus packages and COVID bills and infrastructure bills. We're up to $12 trillion in spending. Now, I say that number 12 trillion, and our brains don't comprehend that. There's no way you can comprehend $12 trillion. So let's throw a couple visuals out here. Okay, so here's a $100 bill, sometimes known on the street as a Benjamin, because of the gentleman on the front there. Now let's do a packet of hundreds. This right here is $10,000. You're looking at $10,000 right there. Pretty nice. Let's make a little pile of those. Right, a little pile. This next picture here, that's 100 packs. That's just a little pile of money right there. You can put that in your a little backpack. That's $1 million right there. That's it. That's what it's not that big, right? I thought $1 million would look a lot more than that. But that's $1 million. Okay, let's go to 100 million. So $100 million. That's a packet, or a pallet. Excuse me. It's a pallet of $100 bills. That's $100 million. Okay, now you're getting. That's a pretty sizable thing, right? Okay, so if I said $1 million to $1 billion. I'd be like, okay, what's $1 billion look like? Well, here, 10 pallets. It's $1 billion. Okay, well, what's after $1 billion? Okay, guys, let's visualize this, right? So there's $1 billion. And if I say, okay, well, the budget's $1 trillion, I'd be like, oh, that's probably a little bit bigger than $1 billion, right? 1 billion to 1 trillion is probably just a little bit bigger. Here's $1 trillion. Those are double stacked. There's 2 pallets high. Okay? The national debt, I'll tell you this, when CNBC, they made a graphic of this back in 2013 when the debt was $11 trillion. Okay, that was 1 trillion. So when the debt was $11 trillion, CNBC made a graphic. And they said if you stack $1 bills, by the way, that was $100 bills. If you stacked $1 bills on top of each other, $11 trillion, our national debt, would be 6 football fields wide and long, right? 6 football fields. Right, imagine a football field, pretty big, 6 football fields, as tall as the Burj Dubai Tower, the tallest building in the world. It's 163 stories in the air. Like, if you told me the national debt was 6 football fields, 1 story high, I'd be like, wow, that's pretty crazy. 163 stories in the air. That's when the national debt was 11 trillion. Do we have pictures of Burj Dubai, by the way? so you can visualize how big that is. Okay, there you go. 6 football fields wide, that tall. That's when the national debt was 11 trillion. Today, it's 28 trillion. $1 trillion stacked up would wrap around the planet 3 times. This year, the federal government is spending 12 trillion. It's 36 trips around the planet of dollar bills stacked. There's no, here, my last point, this is my favorite point of perspective of a trillion. If you counted to 1 million, and you just did one number per second, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? One number per second. And you counted to 1 million, it would take 12 days. Or let me just word it like this. 1 million seconds is 12 days. 1 billion seconds is 32 years. But the difference between 1 billion and a trillion is massive. So if you go ask someone today, say how long is 1 trillion seconds? Right, so 1 billion seconds is 32 years. So if you asked me how long is 1 trillion seconds, I'd be like, I don't know, 132 or 300 years, 31,700 years. 1 trillion seconds is almost 32,000 years. Okay? So we're talking about money that is literally unfathomable. And there's no plan to stop this spending train. There's none. And we're just getting more and more in debt. Now, one of the issues with this debt is we have to pay interest on the debt. When interest rates are super low, like they are now, it's not a huge deal, even though right now interest on the debt is about 10% of our budget. So 10% of our federal government budget, 10% of your taxes just go right to interest on the debt, which is nothing, right? You're not paying for anything, right? But when our debt gets bigger and bigger, and then when interest rates double, well now, it doesn't take long before half of our spending is just interest on the debt. And then what's going to give? This is the head of research and the chief economist at Deutsche Bank, which is a super fun word to say. Go ahead, say it out loud. Deutsche Bank. Few still remember how our societies and economies were threatened by high inflation 50 years ago. The most basic laws of economics, the ones that have stood the test of time over a millennium, have not been suspended. An explosive growth in debt, financed largely by central banks, is likely to lead to higher inflation. We worry that the painful lessons of an inflationary past are being ignored by central bankers, either because they really believe that this time is different, or they've bought into a new paradigm that low interest rates are here to stay, or they're protecting their institutions by not trying to hold back a political steamroller. I'm not exactly sure what the political steamroller means. We're going to talk with our last guest about that. Neglecting inflation leaves global economies sitting on a time bomb. Here's what else I know, and here's something I've learned from COVID. The elites are going to protect themselves. It's just like with COVID. Governors shut down schools, but go ahead and ask Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, how his kids' school year went. His kids went to a private school that met in person all year, all during COVID. His kids didn't miss a beat. And there's countless examples of that. Politicians telling you to stay at home as they jet off to their vacation homes in Mexico. So it's going to be the same thing with inflation. They will find ways to protect themselves. They will set themselves up for success. And they'll do whatever they need to do to weather this storm while everyone else gets crushed. I don't want to be one of those people that's crushed, and I don't want you to either. The head of the Fed says the inflation that we saw in the 70s in America is, quote, very, very unlikely. Do you believe him? How well have our experts done? What's our experts' track record? Let's just take the last 2 years. You think that expert is any different than a global warming expert or a COVID expert? And yes, a lot of the high prices we see now are because of COVID, right? Supply chains getting messed up, people not going back to work because unemployment benefits are too high, right? But then you ask the question, once all that evens out, if it does, what is the new normal, right? The price of wood is through the roof. 1,000 board feet is the pricing for wood, 1,000 board feet. So $450 is the average used to be the average for 1,000 board feet. It went to over 1,600. And yeah, it's going down and it's going to go down, but it's still twice of what it normally is. So if it settles at twice the normal price, yeah, it's better than the peak, but it's still twice as bad as ever. And that's going to be our new normal? Still not good. Who do you trust? The experts at the Fed? Have the experts in Washington, D.C. earned your trust when it comes to anything? We got to take matters into our own hands, and we got to protect our own families. So today, we're going to get the 101 on inflation. Otherwise, we will end up like Zimbabwe in 2009 with their $100 trillion bill that at the time was worth about $30. True story. Mike Slater, Inflation Nation, coming up next. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special Inflation Nation. Want to get right to our guest and get the who, what, where, and what do we do now? The author of Wealth Unbroken, Growing Wealth Uninterrupted by Market Crashes, Taxes, and Even Death. Rebecca Walser is here. Rebecca, how are you?
I'm good, Mike. How are you?
Good to talk to you. Let's do a little 101 here, if you don't mind. Take me back to college, Econ 101. What is inflation?
Inflation is just basically the erosion of our purchasing power. So $1 in the 60s, we know, bought a lot more than $1 in 2021. And so it takes more dollars to buy the same thing. And that's because our dollars are worth less compared to prior times. And that's inflation.
How did they become worth less?
So over time, this is a really big topic you've got here, Mike, to really make in quick little sound bites. But over time, if you look back into the 1980s when Ronald Reagan took office, we had just recently come out of the gold standard completely. We had started going off of it through the world wars and all of those things. But Nixon really dealt the final blow. We completely went off the gold standard. We started to have inflationary pressure. We had hyperinflation, as you kind of remember. But when Ronald Reagan took office in January of 1981, we didn't even have $1 trillion of debt yet as a country. And so it took all the way until October of 81 for us to get to that $1 trillion debt mark as a country. And what has happened is the government is spending so much money so fast since really Reagan's time frame. We went from no debt now to really we have $29 trillion and it grows every single day. On my website, we actually have the debt clock because it's so out of people's minds. And yet the chickens will come home to roost and we will have to pay for what's happening. And it does inflate our dollar. It does make our dollar go down in value if we treat it as, toilet paper when we flood our economy with it, which we have really pumped in $8 trillion since the start of the coronavirus last year in 2020. It is going to have an impact on our purchasing power. There's no economical way to get around it. That's the law of economics.
So there's spending money, there's government spending money, and then there's government printing money. Those are the two culprits?
Yeah, the government has always spent money, right? But how they've spent it is the differential. So if you collect taxation, now certainly taxes can reduce GDP if they're not used efficiently. If the government takes it from a most efficient source of use and then makes it inefficiently used, that can have an impact. But for the most part, it's not the spending so much as the fact that they're printing or inventing the money that they're spending. And that is where we get the inflation.
Okay, let me ask this first. Where do we see it? And then where will we see it? And how badly will we see it, do you think?
Great point. So we just recently got the PPP, the Producer Price Index, the PPI rather, the Producer Price Index. We're always looking at the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and specifically the core CPI, which I'll explain to your viewers what that is. But the Producer Price Index is like the wholesale prices, like what do the wholesalers sell to the retailers for? And we recently got some news that increased by 0.8% in 1 month and annualized year over year was a 6.6% increase. So if you can think of this, if the wholesale prices are going up almost 7% year over year, then that will impact the retailers, because you and I buy our gas, our food, our bread, everything from a retailer. We don't buy it directly from the wholesaler. And so as the wholesale prices go up, we definitely expect retail prices to go up. And what the government has done is they say, if you can believe this, Mike, they say that food and energy is too volatile for tracking inflation. So get that. It goes up too much or it goes up too fast to actually be used to track inflation. So we use a figure called core CPI, which takes out food and utilities. So as your electricity spikes or as food goes up because we have some sort of a shortage or we have inflation and these things become more expensive, we don't look at that in the core CPI number. So you have to really look at the consumer price index, including food and energy, to really see how it's impacting retail prices. The government chooses to disregard that and to look at core CPI. And so they kind of have a little bit of an edge avoiding and talking about inflation, just ignoring it as not part of a real number that we're looking at. And we know that's not really true.
That's so important to know. So if you're looking at the lamestream media and they talk about core CPI and they're like, oh, it's not that bad. It's only gone up 2% or something. But we are now smart enough to know, no, wait, is that the core CPI? Does that include energy or food? Is that what you're saying? We need to ask a little deeper question there.
Yep, you need the actual CPI number. That's correct, because core CPI avoids food and energy. That's right.
Oh, amazing. Okay, how bad could it get? And we don't need to go to like Zimbabwe, although maybe. But what should we like realistically expect when it really hits?
Well, I don't think that the plans are going to be realized. The plans are not for good necessarily for the economy. And I don't want to pick on this administration, but if we can compare the last administration to this administration, I have never in my lifetime seen such a deterioration in all fronts so fast. And so part of the plan, and I don't want to go into this crazy area, but this is reality, because I'm a very analytically based person as a tax attorney and somebody who is a studier of economics and the markets. I believe in data. Give me the data. And without the data, forget about it. And so if we look at the data, we really start to understand that I think that the economic world powers, Mike, the economic world powers really thought that, and still to this day maintain that they think that this virus is an opportunity for the world to reinvent sort of economics globally and governments globally. And I'm specifically talking now about the Great Reset. So we had President Trump in when coronavirus hit, and people do not understand how important that was, because his actions during the virus allowed our country to be so much further along than Project 201 when Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, along with the World Economic Forum, simulated a pandemic in October of 2019. When they simulated it, they literally thought that economies would be on the brink of collapse. They really expected that a shutdown with complete cessation of economic impact, and we would be really on the blink of economic collapse across the world. And that would be shouting out for some kind of world forum to help us, and that would lead to the Great Reset. That is not what happened. We had President Trump at the helm. He very, very quickly started talking about therapeutics, although they obviously said that they didn't work and that we needed a vaccine and all of these things. But you started to see very quickly that the lockdown in many states started to ease, and that people were able to adequately social distance and wear the masks and continue economic work, which was not part of their design or their mapped out strategy. And so when these things happen, and when the country was able to bounce back essentially so much faster than what we expected, and then also the vaccines coming out a lot sooner. There's a lot of vaccine controversy. I won't get into any of that. Of course, that's not the topic. But what I'm trying to say is the sheer sheer speed of the vaccines took out so much economic uncertainty that we would have otherwise experienced remaining shut down for all of the people that felt they needed a gene therapy to get back into normal life. And so we have those now for people that want to take and participate in those. But our economy really, Mike, is so much further along than what anybody ever expected or planned it to be. And that's really because the economic engine was not allowed to stop completely under President Trump. And thank God, because we are in a recovery period and we're getting back to a new normal. And I've been in Florida. We have not been a big shutdown state. We have Ron DeSantis at our helm, but we've been required by private businesses, and I'm an attorney, so I know my rights. We've been required by private businesses to wear masks. And if you wanted to, patriate those businesses, you had to comply. And for the first time this weekend, I literally went into a bunch of different places and nobody's wearing masks. And whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, if you think it's a bad thing, you can stay home and not go out, but the rest of us are getting on with our life.
There's no conspiracy with the Great Reset. It's on. If you go to the World Economic Forum, it talks all about the Great Reset. It's all right there. How do we protect our families from inflation? How do we gird our loins now to prepare for it to come so that we can weather the storm better and not get crushed?
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, Mike, if this was to continue, and so really what has happened in the last year and so since the virus is we've had 3 congressional stimuluses. The CARES Act was first, then the HEROES Act, and then in March of 2021, we had ARP signed. And so all of those together are about $6 trillion, give or take. But what people don't realize is that the Federal Reserve themselves are basically stimulated $120 billion a month. They're buying $80 billion a month of their own treasury, which is quantitative easing, and they're buying $40 billion a month of MBS or mortgage-backed securities. So the Federal Reserve is still pumping in stimulus to the tune of $1.3 trillion a year, even as we go back to work. And this is why Jerome Powell, the chairman, is having trouble really tuning in exactly the level of stimulus that is still needed in an economy that has 9.3 million jobs where employers cannot find workers. So we now have 25 states that have ended the federal step up. Just because a state has ended it doesn't mean it has gone into effect yet. So you have to make sure that you look at the date that it ends in your state. But if the actual $300 a week or $1,200 a month step up and additional federal benefits is ended in your state, then we will start to see, hopefully, a lot of workers that were getting paid more to not be productive, to sit at home and not work, will actually start to come out of that and take jobs. And we need people to get back to work. So the very first thing we need is we need people working again. An economy that has 9.3 million openings, but millions of people unemployed at home is not a productive economy. We must have a return to work. And we need to get that. And that's part of the other thing that I think was intended here, was to really gut the middle class, which this virus has done, and to really gut business owners and to make it more difficult to be an entrepreneur, to have the capital to start a business. So we need as much entrepreneurship as we can to come back together and really rebuild this country. But we need people to go back to work, because if they do, Mike, if they get back to work, then we will not be able, we've already seen it. This very beginning of 2021, we saw it in Q1 when we saw the 10-year yield reach 1.7% because there was too much money flowing into the economy. And so it set yields going off crazy because it was inflation. And so they already see that. They can see now with the producer price index and the consumer price index that inflation is rearing its ugly head. So the more we go back to work, the less the government will have the ability to stimulate, because we'll be creating natural GDP, and it will lead to inflation that people will hold the Federal Reserve accountable for. And that's what's happening. Their plans are being laid to waste because the patriots of this country are literally making the federal government answer for its actions and not be able to perform them in all instances, which is wonderful.
Wealth unbroken, growing wealth uninterrupted by market crashes, taxes, even death. Rebecca Walser. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Mike.
Inflation Nation. More coming up. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special Inflation Nation. I got some numbers here for you from June 2020 to June 2021. Car rentals up 110%. That may be related to the pandemic more, but gas up 56%. Used cars and trucks up 30%. Laundry appliances 20%. Airfares 24%. You can see the rest of the list there, including food hitting double digits. Our friend Joel Griffith is here from Heritage Foundation. Help us make sense of this. Joel, how are you, brother?
Hey, good. Thanks for having me today.
So real quick, what is inflation? Give us the quick of it. How do you see it? How do you view it?
Yeah, inflation is really an increase in the overall price level of goods and services across the economy. You might have specific items in a given month that fluctuate more than others, but when we talk about the inflation rate overall, we're talking about that general increase that we see in a given year on a range of goods and services.
Okay, so let's talk about food. You tweeted the other day that food manufacturing costs in just 15 months have gone up 11.4%. The 9 years prior, it's only gone up 8.8%. Why? And what's to account for why certain things have a higher inflation than other products?
Yeah, I think a lot of us have noticed that big increase in food prices, whether it's going shopping and we see our grocery bills significantly higher or going out to eat. But food was very dramatically impacted over the past year and a half, primarily because of supply chain issues. When you pick up that head of lettuce at the store or that package of burgers that you're going to fry up, and there's a multitude of processes from getting it from the farm or the slaughterhouse all the way to your grocery store for you to pick up and consume. So over that past year and a half, we saw a number of instances, for instance, in which trucking was impacted. Truckers were impacted, or you had situations with slaughterhouses or people working in close proximity, even in rural areas, that weren't able or weren't permitted to work as they normally would have. So all of that impacted those food costs. And then, of course, you have energy costs as well. Shipping those products from coast to coast or from overseas, well, that costs money. And we've seen energy costs, particularly when it comes to transportation, nearly double in some sectors over the past year or so.
Well, this leads to a very interesting question, actually. How much of the inflation that we're going to be seeing here is because of the pandemic versus just everything else? Like I mentioned the rental cars. So my understanding is the rental cars prices are so high is because a lot of these rental car companies sold their cars to stay afloat, and now there's just supply and demand. There's not a lot of cars to rent, so prices go up. So how much of it is from the pandemic?
Yeah, and rental cars and used car prices in general, those have been seeing the biggest price increases of any major sector across the economy. And as you mentioned, we had a lot of rental car agencies that actually sold off their fleets. A lot of the travel industry was not expecting such a sharp rebound. I mean, the airline industry, for instance, might be having record travel this July 4th. Well, just 6 months ago, many of the experts were not anticipating we'd be anywhere close to a full recovery. So you had rental agencies sell off their vehicles, and now you have those rental agencies needing those vehicles back, and they're competing with those of us in the private sector trying to buy cars. And then you compound that with the fact that there's been a shortage of microchips. Well, microchips aren't just used in our computers, of course, they're used in our vehicles. So new vehicle costs have gone up. New vehicles are in short supply in many instances. And so that is putting more pressure on used car prices because more of us are finding it necessary to buy a used vehicle. So the reasons for the inflation are many. These are just some of them pandemic related, but there are some deeper problems as well with inflation that relate directly to our government actions and the actions of our central bank that we should be keeping an eye on for longer term impact.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Yeah, so maybe this is either the straw that broke the back or just revealed a lot of the problems that we have on the foundation. So let's get to that foundation. I heard the other day the Fed talked about maybe raising interest rates in 2023 as opposed to what they were originally planning for 2024. Talk down to me about that. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, our Federal Reserve issues the fiat currency, those dollars that we use in our everyday transactions and also in our big purchases. So the Federal Reserve does try to impact interest rates overall, but the Federal Reserve also prints prints the money, either digitally or in hard currency. Now, you may have noticed that over the past few years, for instance, when it comes to inflation, your home prices have increased dramatically. In fact, over the past year, we saw the median home price increase by well over 25% in a single year. And of course, some people are happy with their home equity increasing, but for those people that are looking to buy real estate, it's become prohibitive. Well, did that just happen? Well, no, the Federal Reserve actually has printed hundreds of billions of dollars, and they've used that to purchase mortgage-backed securities, the mortgage bonds. Well, what happens when you inject that money into the mortgage system? That means there's that much more money to lend and at lower rates. And we have seen people take advantage of that, take out more loans, take out bigger loans. And we have seen home prices increase as a result. That is directly related to actions by our central bank. But most of us don't connect the dots. But this has a very real impact on our day-to-day lives, particularly when it comes to purchasing a home.
Give me a little Econ 101 as to what raising interest rates does to stop inflation from going out of control. Why would the Fed raise interest rates as inflation's going too high?
Well, it's gotten quite complicated in recent years, but the bottom line is when you have the Federal Reserve print money, and that money goes to, say, purchase government bonds, the government can then go ahead and spend that money. That money ends up in the economy. Well, usually money ends up circulating and gets put on deposit at banks, and banks can lend out that money to others. And then those people go ahead and deposit those funds in banks, and the bank lends out those funds as well. And you have a multiplier effect. You can see up to $10 of loans, which count as money, created for every dollar of new currency that's injected into the economy. So in a situation like we've seen over the past year, when you've seen the Federal Reserve print hundreds of billions of dollars to fund government operations by buying government debt, if those dollars were able to be injected in the economy, put on deposit at banks, and then lent out, you could end up with even higher inflation rates. So what the Federal Reserve has been doing to sterilize that, if you will, to sterilize the threat, they have been paying banks money to hold reserves at the Federal Reserve. Because if you've got reserves, if you're a bank, instead of lending out the money that you have on deposit, if instead you just keep it parked away, well, then you actually reduce the inflation threat because that money is not circulating in the economy. But banks, of course, they want to make a profit. They want to lend that money out at an interest to businesses and individuals. So to stop that from happening, the Federal Reserve has been paying interest on those reserves at the bank. Now, it does prevent higher inflation. At the same time, it really distorts our economic system because capital is the basis of capitalism. And in a free market, you really should have businesses, individuals bidding on those resources through promising to pay an interest rate on the loan. And what we've seen now is just a dramatic distortion of our economy. And longer term, even if we don't get sky high inflation, it's going to result in less economic growth.
Wow. Okay. So I'm going back to when I first really started to learn about capitalism. And I just remember this story about in Soviet Union when the local commissar decided to make 1 million pairs of a certain type of shoe, and they were all brown or whatever. And they couldn't make the right number. They didn't know what sizes to make. They didn't know what styles people liked. They didn't even care what colors they were. Right? And the whole thing got screwed up because one person can't dictate the market for shoes. So we have capitalism and we have variety, blah, blah, blah. You get the story. Who do these people at the Fed think they are that they can tweak numbers here and there and interest rates this and to best balance out the entire United States and therefore in many ways world economy? That seems like such an impossible task that's doomed for failure.
Yeah, and the interest rates are just really a small part of this. Of course, we don't have the government telling factories any longer, like they did in the Soviet Union, how many pairs of shoes to make or how many TVs to manufacture. However, we do have the central bank deciding which types of assets to purchase in the open market. So if you look at the Federal Reserve balance sheet, it's not just government debt that they have on the balance sheet, although that's distortionary as well, because when they buy that debt, that empowers the government to spend more, to demand more of our economy. But the Federal Reserve also has printed money to buy corporate bonds, including Apple. They printed money to buy private mortgage-backed securities. They printed money to purchase local government debt as well. So in all these ways, anytime that you have a central bank that prints money to go ahead and purchase certain assets, you are, in effect, directing economic growth from Washington, D.C. That is not how a free market economy should be operating, but it's what we have currently. And I'm really glad that you're raising awareness to this.
Well, I can't end well. Real quick, no financial advice, no one's holding anyone accountable in that regard, but there's a tidal wave coming here with inflation. There's no doubt. What should one do to protect their own finances? Whether you're young and ready to invest, or you're about to retire and your 401k may be just cut in half. What is someone to do?
Well, I would say don't panic right now. We do have much higher inflation than what we've been used to. We can hope that our leaders and those at the central bank have learned from their past mistakes, and that they will make the maybe difficult actions necessary to stop this. However, we should be ready for other scenarios as well. And that means living within your means, living actually even maybe below your means, and saving those additional resources and working with your financial advisor to make sure that the savings that you have for your future and for your family's future, make sure that that's diversified in a manner that will minimize the risk to you should we have difficult scenarios develop. There's not a one-size-fits-all recommendation for individuals. And as I said, there's not a need to panic, but definitely we should all be prudent in our future. You don't want to have all of your investments in one particular type of security. And that's where having a good financial advisor can really pay literal dividends over the longer term.
Well, I put it all in Dogecoin, Joel. I don't know if that, I was hoping you were going to say Doge was a good investment.
If you bought during Elon Musk's SNL performance, you're probably not smiling because of that right now, are you?
No, I'm definitely not. Joel Griffith, Heritage Foundation. Awesome to talk to you, Joel. Appreciate you, man.
All right, thank you.
Inflation Nation. By the way, don't put your money, don't put all your savings in Dogecoin. That was a joke. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to the grand finale of our special Inflation Nation. We talked in the first segment about Deutsche Bank and the warning that their chief economist gave, and I found that letter from our next guest. He's the senior editor of the wonderful PJ Media and author of Making Hate Pay, The Corruption of the Southern Poverty Law Center, Tyler O'Neill. Tyler, how are you, brother?
Doing well. Thanks, Mike.
Good to talk to you. What's your takeaway from this Deutsche Bank letter that their chief economist sent out?
Yeah, no, I think Deutsche Bank is issuing a very important warning that our friends on the left need to take very seriously. We've seen many economists and policymakers are saying that the recent uptick in inflation is temporary, but Deutsche Bank warned that Biden's profligate spending, the Federal Reserve's low interest rates, and global economic trends threaten to unleash a persistent inflation, which amounts to an insidious tax on the poor and middle class that benefits the government. They specifically mentioned the period of stagflation in the 1970s that infamously brought the presidency of Jimmy Carter to an end, but also really inflicted pain on the U.S. economy and on Americans in general. And this is not the future that we want in the 2020s to be a repeat of the 1970s, but Biden is following the path that leads to that outcome.
Yeah, it's interesting. I understand the temporary argument because COVID, and there's definitely, as we talked about in the last segment, there's some aspects like rental cars, are really high inflation. And maybe you're like, oh, that's more of a COVID thing because they sold some of their fleet and now things are back, so it's supply and demand. So I see some temporary things like that, but I also see some other things being much more permanent, as you're alluding to. So I think it would be no different than in the 70s where there were permanent foundational problems, but there was the gas crisis, right? So that was like a trigger that made everything else fall. Is that an okay way of looking at it?
Yeah, no, definitely. And that's actually what Deutsche Bank references, because we're starting to see rising oil prices again, despite the real breakthroughs that we had in recent years with the shale oil boom. We've started to see oil shocks coming to our economy now, but also inflation in many other ways. The price of food is increasing across the board. The price of lumber skyrocketed. And you're seeing odd economic trends right now, like used cars being too expensive for people to find. And even, I got a request from a dealership to sell my car, which is to give them my car, which is 11 years old. So I mean, this is the kind of situation where we're at, and part of it is COVID. But I think the Deutsche Bank report also made some very important arguments that brought it together to broad macroeconomic trends. First, over the past 40 years, the integration of China and other markets into the global economy has meant that hundreds of millions of cheap workers are entering the globalizing workforce. Yet in the years and decades ahead, the working age population will decline, not just in the United States and Japan and those economies, but across the globe. And this means a scarcity of workers, which will drive wages up and increase the costs of the prices of goods and services. And then you've also got the supply chain issues, where COVID-19 revealed the weaknesses in the supply chain, especially here in the United States, when it comes to our medical supply chain, critically important. As we've all been noticing, it relies too much on China. And so as countries crack down on their supply chains, and as the amount of workers entering the global market decreases, signs of inflation are on the up and up. And we really have to balance them. Biden's profligate spending with these trillions and trillions of dollars in these bills is just going to make the problem way worse.
You're the first person who brought up the variables of China, but it just adds to these pile. And it's been a theme of the show where all these variables, and there's countless more that we can never come up with, that just lead me to believe, there's no way a group of people at the Fed can manage this properly. There's way too much going on. And it's the height of arrogance to think that they could manipulate the economy to their liking. It's just way too big.
Perhaps they should.
I remember I was in college. Perhaps. I remember I was in college and ignorant and very tribal. And Bush was in office. George W. Bush was the president. And a lot of spending. At that time, it's when the other party's in office, the other party is against spending, right? That's how that always works. So I remember I was talking to a Democrat, and they were like, spending's out of control, and whatever. And I remember I said something like, that's just funny money, right? I was like a stupid idiot then. I said, it's just funny. It's not a real thing. What's the problem with this funny money? What's the problem with this printing of money? What's the problem with this debt, really? And I asked that because we've been hearing for years and years, right? The first segment we did, the debt in 2013 was like 11 trillion. Well, now, and it's going to be doom, and now it's 28 trillion. It's going to be doom. Right? How is it going to be 100 trillion and we're still going to be doing, it's going to be, when is it going to be the doom?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. The funny money continues to work so long as the U.S. economy and the U.S. dollar doesn't have competitors that will really draw it down. And right now, the entire world is going through some of these shocks. So we have a little bit of a safety net, right? Because even though the dollar is falling and is not very reliable, other currencies are even less reliable. But you're starting to see the rise of cryptocurrencies. And the interesting thing with Bitcoin becoming legal tender in a Central American country means that we're starting to see this competition in terms of possible money supplies. And I don't know when, that's an excellent question, because I thought, 28 trillion, I thought we'd be in trouble way before that. And it's just increasing. The real problem isn't just the number, by the way. It's the percentage of the U.S. economy that our federal debt has taken up, and that is on the upswing. So, this is something we do need to keep track of. And even when Trump was in office, even when he passed the CARES Act, I said, look, we have to get a hold on this. Like, maybe one COVID package is acceptable because the government said told everybody they had to lock down to fight the virus. Yeah. But after that, we have to get our fiscal house in order. And the fact that we're going the other way.
Yeah, I got one more question for you, Tyler, from the letter back to Deutsche Bank. We worry that the painful lessons of the inflationary past are being ignored by central bankers, either because they believe this time is really different, or they've bought into a new paradigm that low interest rates are here to stay. And this is the one I want to ask you. Or they're protecting their institutions by not trying to hold back a political steamroller. I don't know what that means. Do you know what that means? They're not trying to hold back a political steamroller. What are they getting at?
Yeah, so if these financial institutions were to admit the fact that our economy is struggling, the fact that inflation presents this really big problem, they would have to actually look back into the way that the markets have been run, into the way that the Fed has been keeping interest rates low, into the way that the US government has been effectively printing money. And they, this is the suggestion that Deutsche Bank's Volkerts Landau brought up. He's saying that they want to protect their institutions. Part of this is they don't want to admit that they've been wrong and that the economy is facing a dire headwind thanks to their efforts. They want to hold their institutions back, and they're willing to brave a political steamroller if that means they can delay the inevitable just a little bit longer.
That's great. Not wanting to face reality, that ends well. Never. Senior editor of PJ Media, Tyler O'Neill, author of Making Hate Pay, The Corruption of the Southern Poverty Law Center, which we have to have you back on again, Tyler, because people don't realize the teaching tolerance framework in our schools is all from Southern Poverty Law Center. So people need to understand that. So let's definitely talk again. Thanks, Tyler.
It's all Learning for Justice now. Learning for Justice.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. That's their new name. Excuse me. Yeah. Beautiful. Thanks, Tyler. Yep. Appreciate you, man. All right. That's our segment. Much more to come on inflation. Surely. I'm grateful you were here. Grateful we're all ahead of it. True story. Mike Slater. Spread the word.